to say a few words about Lindsay. So she's a student here, an MA student here in the art history program. They are co-founder of the Indigenous Arts Council and editor of the Indigenous Arts Council's Indigenous Literary Arts, Art and Art Criticism Journal. They're also co-founder of the Black Indigenous Harm Alliance. Lindsay's work has appeared in the Malahat Review, Rooms, Guts, Briar Patch, and other publications. And they currently hold the position of Indigenous Editor at Large for Canadian Art Magazine. So thank you, and let's welcome Lindsay.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. Thanks for being here with me today. I know there's a lot going on, and with the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women March, not that we're competing with them, and obviously I'd like to see you guys all there after this event, but yeah, just thanks for being here. Tonsi Nito Timitik, thanks for being here today. For those who don't know, my name is Lindsay Nixon. I'm a nehiyaw-saulteaux-Métis curator, writer, community organizer, an MA candidate in Concordia University's Art History Department. I'm the co-founder of the Indigenous Arts Council. We recently organized the Actes de Literary Festival, which happened here in Montreal this past November. I'm also the editor of IAC's Literary Arts and Art Criticism Journal, Mamawatsi Atsumwak. I also currently hold the position of Indigenous Editor at Large for Canadian Art Magazine. I'm grateful to be here in Tiohtià:ke Muniang, though these aren't my territories. I'm a visitor here. My family's from Saskatchewan and Manitoba. My academic research explores the confluence of Cree, Anishinaabe, and Métis kinship, identities, and communities in the prairies of colonial Canada and northern United States through art practices that negotiate cultural hybridity. But probably more relevant to this talk is my contemporary arts criticism that thinks through issues of kinship, relationality, love through Indigenous feminist art practices and Indigenous relational aesthetics. I'm particularly excited about this exhibit because I've been a longtime fan and advocate of Dana Danger's work, whose work is here on this wall. I wrote about Dana's work mass series for Guts magazine in May 2016 after having seen her work at La Central Gallery Powerhouse in a dual exhibit curated by Heather Iglo-Liorte. That article was a huge success for me, and I was even nominated for a National Magazine Award because of it. I don't think that's just my writing, though. I think that the reason that this piece was so successful was because of Dana's work itself and her practice. It really seemed to resonate with a new generation of Indigenous artists and art thinkers, myself included, who wanted to push against the margins of the Indigenous arts canon and create, show, and write work that represented our own beautiful lives. In a recent response at the Ellen, critic and curator Richard Hill cited his text for Canadian art, wherein he asked, was Indigenous art better in the 1980s and early 90s? Hill's own work canonizing Indigenous art has accumulated in a forthcoming book publication that similarly seeks to canonize the Indigenous art of the early 1990s and 1980s through examination of group shows that produced catalogs during that period of time. Ventures into canonizing Indigenous art have led a new generation of Indigenous artists and visual historians to question, better for whom? Because the 1980s and 1990s were a proverbial dead period for Indigenous queer, trans, and two-spirit art. This is not to say that Indigenous queer, trans, and two-spirit artists were not participating in shows at major galleries, or that these arts weren't happening within the community. Rather, the materiality of Indigenous queer and trans and two-spirit lives were often marginalized within the macro structure and subject matter of the canonized Indigenous art at the time. Canonized Indigenous art of this time was largely focused on issues of resurgence, sovereignty, museological criticisms, and Indigenous identity. Artists weren't, or perhaps weren't permitted, to create art that drew from their bodies, genders, and sexualities for content that was being shown in major galleries, and therefore canonized within Hill's own methodology. This response also wasn't meant to critique the lineage of Indigenous women's performance artists, who began creating from their bodies around this time, using flesh, bone, and blood to give voice to a gendering of colonial violence, histories of dispossession and rememberings that they uniquely embodied. Indigenous women's performance in the 1980s and early 1990s is a lineage of love that queer, trans, and two-spirit artists are undoubtedly indebted to in their own ventures into the material. It also feels important to recognize that even by defining these artists as queer and trans, we appeal to colonial categorizations and logics to do so, because again, queer to whom? Scott Loria Mortensen has written extensively about the hetero and cisnormativity, about how hetero and cisnormativity were supplanted into Indigenous communities in order to subjugate and colonize them. Pre-contact, many Indigenous communities exhibited sexual diversity and gender variance, even having multiple genders or specific roles in community for their gender-fluid kin. Further, we know that historical documentation shows that sexuality was not heavily monitored or disciplined in traditional society. There was a general affect of sex positivity and openness about sexuality. Sexual relations, love, and childbearing were not necessarily presumed to be tied up in the Judeo-Christian tradition of marriage and nuclear family. So, coming back to the arts canon, why do we see open expressions of sexuality, and to borrow from queer theorist, gender fucking, not represented until the 2000s? What makes these experiences inherently less Indigenous, less worthy of representation in the gallery? I want to reiterate that this art wasn't happening, but an issue of canonization. While Hill critiques the Indigenous arts as being incapable of criticizing one another, what's interesting to me about this narrative is its masculinist approach. Because when I think of the logic that keeps us kind, reciprocal, and responsive to each other's work, I think about the relational philosophies that were taught to me by my women kin. My kinship teachings tell me that I'm responsible to my relationships with all creation. I think this is a really interesting starting point, for me at least, to consider how Two-Spirit folks have been left out of the Indigenous arts canon until more recently. We have to recognize that a great deal of the gallerists or arts administrators in the 1980s and 1990s were white. These administrators, through their curation and reinforced by the top-down hierarchy of Canadian arts funding, were able to pick and choose who was shown in galleries at the time. So these administrators will privilege a masculinist framework within the gallery, a framework that doesn't deal with complex issues of sexuality and gender, a framework that focuses solely on issues of Indigenous identity, as if complex genders and sexualities aren't a part of Indigenous identity to begin with. Even when we do begin to see Two-Spirit identities creeping into the canon, like with Kent Monkman's Mischief Eagle Testicle, it's typically been work by cis gay men, whose work readily and easily fits into the canonization of dominant art, and who have been legitimated by a generation of white gay men in the arts, who project their own class-inflected identities into Indigenous art curation and legitimization. So while Hill cites identity politics as a burden on Indigenous art criticism, perhaps the real burden is the forgetting of an entire part of our communities, whose identities have been denied representation within the Indigenous art canon. Though such critiques have been relegated to the realm of Indigenous feminism, this is again a reification of colonial structures within our own communities. Andrea Simpson has written extensively about how Indigenous women's communities were subjugated in order to naturalize colonial processes within Indigenous communities. Women who held positions of power and esteem saw their realms of domesticity devalued and marginalized within the settler colonial project. This is the antithesis to Indigenous kinship, which envisions Indigenous community as a series of self-containing, concentric circles, men on the exterior, then women, then children and elders at the center, with Two-Spirit people flowing freely throughout. So the marginalization of Two-Spirit within Indigenous art canon is more than just an issue of representation. It's an issue of kinship, relationality, and sovereignty. Even in the very reification of the scaffolding of the arts community, the fixation on arts catalogs as historical record, the defining of one singular Indigenous art canon that fits neatly within the white box, marginalizes in itself Indigenous arts practices. Indigenous art is very much grounded in relational aesthetics. Indigenous art is more than the tapestries, drawings, beadworks, and other objects made consumable for the gaze of the settler. It is so much more expansive, youthful, radical, and dynamic than its limited presentation in exhibitions that have dominated major galleries. Indigenous art is life, work presented and colonially legitimated in galleries is in fact alive, animate, and relates to the Indigenous communities to which it belongs. Indigenous gatherings aren't festivals, shows, curations, they're ceremonies, gathering of kin both new and old. For Indigenous people, togetherness and community process is, in itself, art. Indigenous art is kinship. It is ceremony. It is love. Indigenous art is a sacred link to all our relations of past and of our future, a disruption of linear settler space-time, and a grounding of Indigenous spatial, temporal, and cosmic realms. It is a return to embodied knowledges, and what Jolene Rickard calls visual sovereignty. I also think you'll find that many Indigenous curators who will probably even struggle today to articulate the importance of a work like Dana's or Adrian's in the gallery today, precisely because they've come to internalize a shame around sexuality that they've adopted from legacies of residential schooling. It's not solely that we've marginalized two-spirit art, but that we're still working through legacies of shame around our own bodies and sexualities. But this is exactly why work like that completed by Adrian Stimson and Dana Danger for Sovereign Acts 2 is so important. Dana Danger and Adrian Stimson are two of the many Indigenous artists who are creating from their bodies, genders, and sexualities like never before in Indigenous arts histories. Contemporary Indigenous artists on Turtle Island convey kinship in their works to envisage resurgence outside of the cis-sexist and heteronormative relationships that we've internalized. Accounting for the intricate and multiple ways we interact as interconnected communities puts us in a position to consider the location, or lack thereof, of two-spirit people within conceptions of Indigenous resurgence and peoplehood. It was Billy Ray Belcourt who questioned which of our peoples are actually present in the Indigenous future, borrowing from Spivak to ask, can the other of Native studies speak? Dana Danger's masks ask that Indigenous communities consider how our own sexualities and genders factor into our future imaginaries, what Kwali Driscoll has called a sovereign erotic. Danger presents a series of photographs featuring Indigenous models wearing black leather BDSM fetish masks adorned with rows and rows of beads, black matte glossy beads. One mask prominently features a labyrinth, a symbol associated with lesbian feminism or radical feminism. Danger produced the masks with the help of Indigenous relations from among her community. Hours of painstaking care and love were put into the masks, just as would be into any beading project. The image of beading entire masks of leather evokes the literal blood, sweat, and tears integrated into the work itself. Indigenous peoples' sexualities are frequently equated to histories of sexual violence, commodified and institutionalized by settlers seeking to dominate, discipline, and control Indigenous bodies. Danger's use of the leather BDSM mask references the kink community as a space to explore complicated dynamics of sexuality, gender, and power in a consensual and feminist manner. Danger engages with her own medicine, beading, in order to mark kink as a space for healing colonial trauma. There is no shame in this action. Here, the models' gender, expressions, and sensual lives are as integral to their resurgent identities as Indigenous peoples. In this new work, Dana also expands on issues of kinship. The subjects interact in the center, and you notice a shared traditional tattoo on the left wrists of the center pair. Sasha, on the right, reaches out to Lindsay on the left, and Lindsay fiercely guards and holds her own body. Not only are Dana's subjects boldly taking up space in the gallery, but they're doing so in a mutually supportive way, as a mutually supportive set of figures who exist in extended kinship relations with one another. Adrian Stimson's work also speaks effectively to issues of sexuality and gender. Drawing from gay hookup and cruising culture, Stimson represents his video work in glory holes that, when you peer into, you in essence become the objectified hole yourself. This playful use of sexuality grounds humor to engage with issues of embodied colonialism. Stimson's glory holes are the various colors of the medicine wheel: red, yellow, black, white, and there is one hole for each direction: north, south, west, and east. When you peer into the glory holes, you see exactly how Buffalo Boy gets it from all directions, and in doing so, position yourself to also get it from all four directions. The north is a visual of buffaloes, fading, hazy, almost undecipherable. The west, a Western-style campy visual of an exaggerated buffalo pelt, and Stimson's alter ego, Buffalo Boy, who dances wildly in a cowboy getup, cracking and waving a whip in a fully fringed cowboy getup. The South, again, presents an exaggerated buffalo pelt, crawling across the desert ground in front of a smudge bowl, speaking an indigenous language as white men ride around it in bikes. And finally, the East, wherein Stimson subverts the theory of Orientalism and portrays imperialist European cities of the West as conquerable and able to be enacted upon by the now dominant West. Stimson shows the viewer that these realities of coloniality, the disappearance of our ancestors like the buffalo, infiltration by the almost comical spectacle of the West, imperialism and voyeurism, are not easily separated from his identity as a gay man. Getting it from all four directions is a process very much represented, felt, and embodied in Stimson's sexuality and gender. Every day, Indigenous peoples are restoring their beings, bodies, gender, sexualities, and reproductive lives from colonial institutions through play, self-representation, and sexual self-determination, enacting kinship in their art. The Indigenous artists discussed here embody the past and the future in their present representations, projecting decolonial love and kinship into the cosmos. The future imaginary becomes a realm within which Indigenous artists express disconnection from kinship and land, a medicinal space to imagine new futures for Indigenous life, ways of being, relating, resisting, and resurging through love. Thanks.
I wanted to ask you about, because there's a third work in the room, there's a third artist in the room, which is Shelley Nero, this piece at the back here, on the wall here.
Oh, this one, okay.
And which is a curatorial choice.
Right.
Right, and it's this, you spoke a bit about maybe a retrospective sort of discord with what Bridget Hill's project, right, and maybe participating in overwriting queer Indigenous artists. But in this room, Wanda Nabush, the curators, included Shelley Nero. So I'm wondering, which is a work from 1992. And I'm wondering how you would read Nero's work in relationship to Dana's and Adrian's work.
Yeah, when I was in the gallery, I came the day of the opening, so it was pretty kind of chaos. So I didn't get to spend much time with Shelley's work, unfortunately. And when I came to this room, I just saw like Adrian's work and Dana's work like juxtaposed against each other, and I was like, oh, this is trying to say something. These two things are in conversation with one another. I don't know. I haven't seen Shelley's work closely. It's like just different representations of womanhood, I guess. I'm sorry, I wish I had a better critical commentary. I just haven't spent much time with the work. Do you know the artist statement behind it, or?
Well, I mean, there's a bit of role play in it, right? We have, there's Nero taking on Marilyn Monroe's figure, and name, or image at least, right? And I don't know, I've been sort of thinking about it while coming back to this work and this show, and trying to think about it like how it would be corresponding to the Buffalo Boy, or with Davis project. I mean, part of it, I think, for me, is that, I mean, Marilyn Monroe was an assumed name.
Sorry?
It was an assumed name, right? It's a stage name. So there's this sort of possibility in playing Marilyn Monroe in this piece, or Nero's and Indigenous women playing Marilyn Monroe, that I see is also possible, say, in correspondence with, say, Buffalo Boy and Stimson taking on these characters, this shows. And also maybe the possibilities that Dana's masks offer in terms of role play, or sort of shifting, or always sort of mutable position that can be taken.
Yeah, the one thing that comes up for me with that is like the connection to power with like different representations. So when we look at like Shelley Nero taking on a visualization that evokes Marilyn Monroe, what I see is her grappling with normative white femininity and having to put that on, that like that's a colonial thing that she has to enact with her own sort of gender and like sexuality, to be read as feminine, to be read as a woman. And that's really interesting in conversation, with Adrian's piece, where he does this sort of like gay fringe cowboy. So he's like sort of playing like with this like cowboy culture, which like sort of like oppresses him, and literally like the Wild West, which like seeks to colonize and like take up land and like terra nullius, and then he's sort of subverting it by making it this like gay Indian cowboy figure, which like really, I think that Dana's work is very separate of that, because I don't think that anything about this says that she's dealing with normative gender or white gender or like white sexuality or like visualities. She's very much asserting like these models are like naked. The only thing that they're presenting is their desire, their sexualities, their genders, which are made very much indigenous by the masks that they wear. And it's kind of cool that they're like these dual meaning, like BDSM mask, but also like that wrestlers wear these masks, so they're very fierce and like confronting in that way. And the scale, it's like you can't ignore them. They just like they take up space and presence in the gallery. Yeah.
I mean, I think also not more just, you know, the question of kitchen. Because I mean, the other representations are reminding themselves. So it's kind of that thread through, you know, feminine thread. The representations that take on in relation to something that was probably very present in her mother's life. Someone in her life is showing her up in her 60s. She's not at the time married, not at the time working. So I think the kinship is also a relationship.
That's very cool, yeah. And that's so interesting too to think about how she's not just talking about these good knowledges necessarily that she got from her mom. She's talking about normative white femininities that she learned from her mom. Like that's a really intense and personal thing. Any other questions?
What do you think would be Richard Hill's response?
To what I wrote?
No, to your presentation.
Well, I'm gonna try to like publish this actually on Canadian Art, so I have to get his permission to do so. So we'll see. I hope it's good. He's like trying to open a discourse where we can like all critique each other. So put your money where your mouth is. Any other questions?
I could ask, I got the microphone fixed now.
Do it.
I'll ask you another question.
Sure.
Thinking about more of art historical methodologies, maybe in queer methodologies, and networks of circulation. I mean, you'll be publishing this soon online. And I heard echoes of other things that you've written and because you've been thinking through Dana's work for a while now. So how do you envision or map out a means of, or sort of queer means of publishing? Thinking also sort of like, because Richard, when he was here, spoke about doing a variety. He wasn't sure what form it might take. Maybe it'll take a form as a book, but maybe it would be an online seminar, or a series of short sort of documentaries or interviews. So I'd be curious as to how you imagine disseminating this critique and also your work as you go on with your project.
Yeah, I mean, my work and my practice has been very much rooted in DIY, queer publishing, underground book fairs. I think the queer community raised me, and there's something to be said about the fact that I exist also in a community that isn't the most like open or accepting of like queerness and like trans identities, and the fact that I had to find a home in the city amongst queer kin. And I don't think that like queer love and Indigenous love are so different either. I think that I remember reading some of like my earliest queer ancestors in the library when I was 13, and just falling so in love with these unabashed love affairs between queer kin that I knew that this was a possibility to be a healing space for both my gender and my sexuality, which I view as a colonial trauma. So I'm not totally ready to do away with like queerness. I still have a lot of like ties to the queer community, but I can also see the ways that like queer communities are very like Eurocentric, they do reproduce dominant structures that they're not always accountable to because they self-proclaim themselves to be a very subversive community, but I'll always have deep ties to that community, I think.
In Dana's work there seems to be like a gradation of color tone between the models, moving from, I don't know, the back wall to the front wall. And I was just curious if you had any deeper thoughts about what that might be getting at.
Yeah, I mean, I'm straight up going to say that I don't think that was even her intention. I know just from production that she produced these two on the other side for an exhibit that was curated by Heather Iglo-Liorte, and they appeared alone in the gallery. And then she recently shot these two in the middle, and these two. So this is me, so I can speak to it. And this is like one of my lifelong best friends. I've known this person for over 10 years. She's one of my closest relatives. And so she moved towards like representing kinship, and she wanted to do that by showing touch, representing touch like between us to sort of break down this like the frames or the division between the frames. But when she was positioning them in the gallery, it obviously like they just fit well when they look visually well, like they're all pointing to the middle when these two on the other side. So I'm straight up going to say that I don't think that she did that intentionally, but I'm going to let her know that that is the way it's being read, because that is kind of interesting, actually. That has like a lot of meaning to the work.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you.